Dr. D. Shrock.
No, Jeff brought an orchestra with him. That was beautiful. Well, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. Hi everybody. So today I'm going to talk about the power of the mind. I have so much to say, but one thing I hope to make crystal clear is not only is the mind extremely powerful, it's more powerful than you can even imagine, and I mean it. So here goes. How many of you ever read any of Jane Roberts' books, like Seth Speaks or The Nature of Personal Reality? Okay. Well, I read those books back in the 70s, and I'm not even sure how or why I became interested, because at that time, that was not my interest whatsoever. But I was fascinated, but the one thing that totally got me, and I knew that this was a bit much, you create your own reality. Do you remember that? Because everyone wish I had more time to say, I wish I could ask you, my God, what were you thinking when you read that? Is that really possible? Is it true? So anyhow, this is part of my life, now 40 years later, that I'm telling you, it is more true than you can understand. So, even though I only read about this in the 70s, I don't want you to forget when those books were actually written. I don't know if they were in the 60s, but regardless, what I didn't know then was that between 1918 and 1933, 4 physicists received the Nobel Prize in Physics for coming up with this kind of conclusion. Reality doesn't exist until we observe or measure it. There is only formless potential energy that comes form once consciousness is introduced. And what I want to remind you and inform you is that this consciousness is you. So a fundamental quantum life force energy underlies and connects everything. I know this isn't new to you, but I want you to understand the serious science of this. The idea that, in fact, you can create your own reality. Now, one physicist in particular, Dr. David Bohm, actually called this fundamental quantum field that underlies everything a primary reality. And that the ultimate nature of the universe was, in fact, a field of love. And so, in fact, he and others then really began to give a science to religion. So where many might understand or think of this life force, which has been given many names, such as God, or even the life force, or ki, or chi, or prana, this ultimate nature is one of love. And that everything is this field, or God, manifesting in form. We are the mind of God expressed in form. And one of the things I discovered in my just trying to understand all of this and look at various religions and their beliefs was, one, I've said this before because it's part of my sense of humor, religions disagree on almost everything. But, in fact, one of the things that astounded me was that, in fact, all major philosophic religions, beliefs, believe this thing in particular, that we are, in fact, one with all there is, one with God. Now that's huge. Even to this day, that's too big for me to wrap my mind around, that what even might sound blasphemous to many people, the idea that we are God. But if you get that, and you can wrap yourself around it, now when I tell you that your mind is powerful, or more powerful than you can even possibly understand, maybe it doesn't become so crazy, so big, too big. So I want to leave you with this thought before I move on. I honestly believe your purpose here in life, one of them certainly, is to experience the joy of creating in the physical. So not only do we have this power, that we came here, I honestly believe, to actually experience this joy of being able to create our lives. What do you think of that? Okay, so back in the 70s, it was when I was first really introduced to what I call the power of the mind, and I learned about guided imagery and self-hypnosis. And I have to tell you honestly, I thought it was way too good to be true. There's no way. I mean, I don't know. For example, I was actually pleased that in graduate school I had the opportunity in that setting to see a stage hypnotist. And so I don't know if any of you have had that experience. And there's a part of that that you go, yeah, right, that can't be true, except, you know, if you really look at this and study it like I have, even though anything can be faked, it was fascinating to watch what these, I remember you're in college, you're broke, you know, and here, this guy's up on stage and he threw a $20 bill on the stage. And for those who he had hypnotized, he said, that's yours if you can pick it up. But he told them they couldn't pick it up. Now, how many of you really believe that? Because there's a $20 bill on the stage and the guy said you can do it and you're broke. Except when you see this, you go, oh my goodness. Well, anyhow, what it really led me to believe was this was still way too good to be true, and that's actually one of the fundamental reasons why I decided to go to graduate school and try to figure this out, because there had to be something else. Honest to goodness, I didn't go back just to try to figure this out, like why did that work? It was like, no, there was something else that was really at work here. So, one of the things I discovered early on, this is back in the 70s, just the first time, 1978, 1979, was that, and I think the primary interest I had at that time had to do with my hay fever symptoms, which I had suffered with for about 15 years. So for those of you who have gone through something like that, you know you can get really doggone irritable and lots of other stuff that aren't fun. So, in fact, a real personal aside, I remember one time I had a girlfriend early on and dealing with my symptoms, and one day she leaned over and just put her hand gently on my thigh and just came out of me, don't touch me. Hay fever. But there was a part of me going, darn it, that's not okay. You know, and I remember when the doctor told me with my symptoms, and there wasn't really anything that he could give me or tell me to do that would make the difference, is you have to live with that. That was one of the best things somebody ever told me, because there was no way. And I didn't have an answer, but there was no way that was going to be acceptable and that I was going to be able to live with that, or would choose to live with that. So anyhow, the following year after I first began to study this, and for 10 more years, I had no hay fever symptoms, practicing guided imagery. Until another humorous aside, until 10 years later when I got engaged to be married. That's a whole other presentation. How about stop smoking? Back then I didn't smoke a lot, but I still did smoke, and I didn't want to do it anyhow. So I used guided imagery to stop my smoking. This was one that was a bit much for me, but it absolutely happened. I was much smaller then, much smaller than I am now. And when I was making this major change in my life to start studying this kind of thing, and I was advised psychically to put on weight. But in making this major life change, I needed this additional, I forget the term used at the time, but you know, I was too thin and I needed additional weight. But I had owned clothing stores prior to that for about 8 years. And I was very vain and interested in appearance and clothing and so forth. So the idea of putting on this weight, you know, 15 or 20 more pounds was not appealing. So my friend who taught me this in the first place said, why don't you imagine the size, shape, and weight you would like to be? I can't tell you how many times I rolled my eyes at this guy. Yeah, you can really do that. But he would challenge me and say, you know, what have you got to lose? And so it actually took a month for me to put on weight, believe it or not, but then it really started to come on. But in fact, my waist size then I think was about 29. And so I imagined that I would stay that same size, you would still be able to wear the same size trousers and whatever else. I thought, that's a pretty one, if I can stay at 29. And guess what happened? Honest to goodness. So there were so many times I shook my head early on, and I would say even still today, sometimes I go, I can't quite get over what you can really do, what you can really learn to do with the power of your mind. There's more to it that I won't be able to get in today, but still. What usually gets people's attention the most, though, was that I was able to avoid surgery with my knee. When I was in undergraduate school, I played soccer and ended up hurting my knee badly. The only good news is it kept me out of Vietnam, but the orthopedic surgeon, who was the orthopedic surgeon for the Pittsburgh Steelers, I say that on purpose because so many people want to tell me, including a lot of my medical doctor friends, there was no way your knee had to have been misdiagnosed. No, it was not misdiagnosed. Anyhow, he said, you can try to rehab it, but you will have to have surgery within 10 years. So I tried to do the rehab, and it turned out to be 12 years later before my knee really did hurt, and I was limited in my mobility, and I figured now I have to have the surgery. So my friend who taught me this originally again says, hey, why don't you imagine your knee healed and avoid the surgery? But again, he had this way of challenging me and said, 1 week, give it 1 week and see what happens. In 2 days, I had no pain whatsoever. And by the end of the week, I had full use of my knee, and I've never had surgery. So now I was really determined to figure out what in the world is going on. And through that process, in fact, my doctoral dissertation was titled Relaxation, Guided Imagery, and Wellness. I came to realize, in fact, it made academic presentations about the 10 hypotheses to explain the effectiveness of guided imagery. And as some of you also know too, even went on to be invited to co-author the chapter on mind-body medicine in Dr. Andrew Weil's textbook, Integrative Oncology. So I know the research, and I know still for so many people it sounds too good to be true, but this is legitimate. I know that in my experience, though, in teaching, that more times, I think even though telling you some of this other stuff gives it credibility, but that you like stories and that you can relate and be inspired by stories. So the most inspiring, I have one that I may have shared with you before, but was when I was director of mind-body medicine for the cancer centers, and it was my responsibility to go around and introduce myself and be available for patients and families, but also to teach a wellness program, and absolutely included guided imagery. And by that time, I had also interned with Dr. Carl Simonton, who was the one oncologist who actually pioneered the use of guided imagery with cancer. If you've ever heard about that doctor who said, imagine your immune system like Pac-Man cells going around. Okay. So I had that opportunity to actually work with Carl, and actually when I returned to my cancer centers then to implement a program like Carl's, where we could teach people how to really do what they needed to do to get well beyond what they might do medically. So anyhow, I was in a cancer center of ours near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when I met a man who just everybody called Bud. And I had read his medical chart and also been informed by his physician that Bud probably had 2 months to live. You know, it's just what we do as part of informed choice, to let people know, you know, what their particular diagnosis and symptoms and prognosis is. But I try not to let that color too much when I interact with people. You know, hey, you have this stage and whatever else. But anyhow, Bud was in a wheelchair to begin with, and he was not comfortable. He was in a lot of pain. But he was there with his wife, and I thought, I'm going to introduce at least who I am and my availability, and encourage him to come to my wellness classes. So that actually began that night. So after I met him and introduced myself, I was sure Bud would not be back. He just was in no condition to come to class, except he did. But like some of the stories presented earlier, but there's the good news and the bad news. Well, the good news was Bud showed up. The bad news was when I started talking about guided imagery, and you could imagine your body functioning properly to manage pain symptoms or whatever else. Bud leaned forward in his chair. Oh, he was not happy. The idea, because I've worked with chronic pain, and I remember working in a rehab hospital where we would see people who probably had an average of 5 years of chronic pain and medical treatment and nothing working. And then they come see me, who's going to tell them they can imagine their pain away. So I was used to it, but anyhow. So I thought, okay, this is it. Bud's not coming back. But I at least planted that seed. And as part of what I did there also, then it was cassette audio tapes and players. So I had created one that I gave to all the patients and encouraged them to listen to their guided imagery tapes each day that week to reinforce the information from that particular presentation, including the idea that you could imagine your immune system, in fact, eliminating cancer cells. So I had 5 more classes to go. Bud came back to every class. What I didn't realize, till it went on further, that he took that audio tape and his cassette player with him everywhere. And you know me, doctor's orders go fishing. Bud truly did love to fish. He took that with him on his boat. He listened to it while he was fishing. He listened to it all the time. When the wellness series was over, and now Bud's not expected to live even a month, right? He came up to me and said, I want to buy a boat. And this is where I like to say, get real. This guy's supposed to be, I mean this while I'm speaking candidly about this, but he's supposed to be dead within a month. He's got all these medical expenses, so many other things to deal with, and he asked me, should I buy that boat? And I love to ask others, what would you have said to Bud?
Buy the boat.
Well, in fact, remember the position I was in. So I couldn't say buy it, but I could not say don't buy it. But what I will say, and I came to say to people, is live like you're going to live. I mean that. Live like you're going to live. Or still, there's a very practical $10,000 bill here, etc. Anyhow, the real good news of this story is Bud and his wife Shirley, and those are their real names. They would love, I can feel this, they would love them sharing with this story their names. Said they had the best summer of their lives. Bud eventually did die, and maybe that's the thing I want to leave you with as well. When they did bury Bud, they buried him with his audio cassette and tape player. Honest to goodness. Anyhow, so I know this kind of thing is in science what we call anecdotal, but I also know after 40 years of doing this is that I can feel very comfortable telling you about the real power of this anecdotally as well as beyond a lot of good science now. So, I want to transition now, though, into the idea of prayer. Because within my study of these, what we call deliberate intention techniques, there's guided imagery, there's self-hypnosis, there are affirmations, there's prayer. And that was another thing that baffled me early on, was it's just too good to be true. The idea that you can pray and I don't know, these weird images I had, or maybe they weren't that weird. The idea of, okay, we're nagging God, okay, come on, do this. And so, I don't know, it just didn't quite settle. But now, honestly, there are actually more than 100 studies looking at the effectiveness of prayer. But I want to explain it to you in a way that's very practical and why I would encourage you to pray if you believe in the power of prayer. Because it's still all about thought. You know, and when you understand the placebo effect, the idea that all of your beliefs and expectations have a tremendous effect on whatever it is that you would like to have happen. But I want to intercede here and say right away, but what we do usually, which is totally counterproductive, is spend more of our time worrying So remember, all of your thoughts count. Ideally and preferably and really emphatically with your deliberate intention, like in prayer. But if you spend a good part of your time, remember when the law of attraction, remember that came up and it was a big deal? Okay. And people were trying to explain why it didn't work. My opinion, the reason why it didn't work is you spend, however long you did doing your prayer or whatever else positively, and the rest of the day worrying. So you were sabotaging what you were really trying to do, right? Okay. So anyhow, be careful about your thoughts. They really are powerful. They count. Remember, they literally create or contribute to your reality. That's both the good news and the bad news. Isn't it cool to really know that you can create your life? And you can screw it up. So in my trying to understand this, one of the things I came across was a statement in the Bible attributed to Jesus where he said, essentially, pray, believing you have already received. That is a perfect description of guided imagery. So if you choose to do this, and I do recommend you do this, make no mistake, is pray believing you've already received. Now if you understand the idea of the quantum field and that you're God and so forth, you really do understand how and why that would be true. But it's another encouragement and a way to think about it, that you can create or certainly contribute to, or I like to say increase the odds of what you want in your life. And I wrote a note to myself, that kind of a fun way to say this. If the placebo effect works now, we know that we have to control for it in doing any research. Do you think it worked at the time of Jesus?
Yes.
All right, so imagine Jesus talking to people and telling about the power of prayer. He wouldn't likely have said, okay, I want you to go home tonight and practice the placebo effect. But if you understand this, placebo effect has always worked. But we might have used a different language or a different way to understand it to, in fact, then be able to help people, teach people. And so as part of preparing for today, I thought, and I'd never checked this, I was curious about the origin of prayer. So when or how did we learn about the idea that you could create your reality? And as best I can determine, there isn't really a time, although so many religions and even shamanism and so forth have talked about and used prayer, but as far as I can determine, it was probably information given from Spirit to us humans that this is in fact something you can do to help yourself. So whatever you label it, whether you call it prayer or guided imagery or hypnosis, it is real. It's the power of your thoughts and your beliefs. Pray, believing you've already received. So now I want to cite one thing out of my book very briefly, because Larry Dawsey, Dr. Larry Dawsey has been someone who's been very inspirational for me and very helpful for me in my work, actually. Anyway, I want to quote this from Dr. Dawsey. The use of prayer will become the standard in scientific medical practice in most medical communities. So pervasive will its use become that not to recommend the use of prayer as an integral part of medical care will one day constitute medical malpractice.
Oh, wow.
Fine. Now, I feel like I'm going to just hold you up with more research, but I want to share with you, just because it's like, this can't happen, it's too good to be true, or it's magic. Remember I told you earlier, stuff can be faked, and so we think then it can't be done in fact, but very early on, we're talking the early 70s, I had this nice introduction to this craziness. And I was at a conference in Arizona. I'm not even sure what the conference was about. But here was a man, he called himself Komar. And there was a bed of nails. And I mean, really like a full bed of nails. And you get to see how sharp it is. They show you that. There's no kidding around. And now Komar lays down on this bed of nails. Now, there's another bed of nails, which they now set on top of Komar. So he is now sandwiched between this bed of nails. Now what they do is they invite 4 large men from the audience to come up and sit on this bed of nails, on top of Kumar. Yeah, and there's no way you should be doing this. You know, this, who in their right mind would do that and think this is okay? Now, even funnier for me, and this is a true story, I was standing as close as I am to you when this was going on. In one of his hands, Kumar is holding a can of Coke, and in his other hand, an unfiltered Camel cigarette lit that he's smoking. So this wasn't exactly a scientific demonstration. But the fact is, when they got back up off Kumar and took off, he had nothing but dents in his body. There was no bleeding, there was no damage, nothing. But even more, later that night, in another demonstration, and whatever you're trying to prove about, I guess, the power of the mind or the power of what you can tap into to do this stuff, he walked up a ladder of machetes in his bare feet. I know. So this was, again, before I even got to study this, but there's no way in your mind you can't be going, how did he do that? So much later in my life, when I was, done a lot of my work and was presenting at a scientific conference about self-regulation, and there was a guest presenter there who was a yoga master. And his name was Mr. Kawakami. I never met him before. I always thought it was pretty funny that they chose to have him as the speaker over lunch. So while you're eating your lunch, here's Mr. Kawakami up there, and he takes, it looked like a big knitting needle, and he just puts it right through his throat. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking over lunch. But I can't deny or ignore this is what he's doing. So that was just for starters. Then he pulls out a double-bladed knife and shows you how sharp it is. By the way, I don't speak Japanese, he doesn't speak English, he had a translator. And they're explaining a little bit. Anyhow, so he asks if 2 people from the audience would come up and squeeze his hand while he places the knife in his palm, and if they would squeeze his hand to help demonstrate what he wanted to do. And there's a way, again, I'm being really honest, there's no way, this is nuts. He's going to, in fact, get cut. So here's the topper. He asked somebody else from the audience to come up and pull that knife through his hand while these guys are squeezing it. I volunteered. I can't believe to this day I did. Well, maybe I can. So I'm up there, and my eyes were closed. I was not going to look at this. And I'm saying it's going to cut his hand. I had no sensation of when I started or when I stopped. There was no resistance whatsoever. Now I'm really puzzled. So I asked the translator, I don't know my exact language, what in the world was he thinking? What was he doing so he could do that? I was one with the knife. That was it. Now I got to see him do that a number of times later. We actually became friends. And at one scientific congress, they had him hooked up to every instrument imaginable. You see, okay, what really goes on within the body when he does something like that. And I remember standing next to one scientist in particular who was really familiar with this kind of research on what we call subtle energies. She was shaking her head. She said, there is no indication of trauma. None. She just stood there shaking her head. So even though we know this can be done, we try to understand it, there is no way, I'm going to tell you, if for any reasonable person to not shake his or her head around, oh my God. So, having told you that, I'm going to leave you with this topper of all toppers. If any of you know Baird Spalding, or his 5 little volumes about the life and teaching of the masters of the Far East, this is the most inspirational book in this regard I have ever read about what can be done. He was part of a scientific group who went to investigate master teachers in the Himalayas and did it for about 3 years. Unfortunately, the research and writing is no longer available. I even had the opportunity, very uniquely, to talk with Baird in a channeled session one time. So unfortunately, there's no scientific information to pass on or reference for you. Anyhow, here's what Baird had to say. So one Sunday afternoon, Emil, this special master, Hindu master, and I were walking in a field when he called my attention to a pigeon circling overhead and casually remarked that the bird was looking for him. He stood perfectly still, and in a few moments the bird alighted on his outstretched arm. He said the bird has a message from his brother in the north. This proved to be a fellow worker who had not reached the attainment whereby he could communicate directly, so he took this means. We later found that the masters are able to communicate with each other instantly by thought transference, or as they call it, a force much more subtle than either electricity or wireless. I then began to ask questions, and Emil showed me that he was able to call the birds to him and direct their flight while they were in the air, that the flowers and trees would nod to him, that the wild animals would come to him fearlessly. He parted 2 jackals that were fighting over the body of a smaller animal that they had killed and were feeding upon. When he approached them, they stopped fighting and put their heads in his outstretched hands in perfect trust, then resumed their meal in quiet. He even gave me one of the young wild creatures to hold in my hands. Every day during this time, I had lessons with Emil. He would suddenly appear in my room, even if I had taken special care to lock the door before retiring. At first, his appearance at will disturbed me, but I soon saw that he took it for granted and that I understood. I became accustomed to his ways and left my door open so that he could come and go as he pleased. This confidence seemed to please him. I could not understand all his teachings, and I could not accept them fully, nor was I able, with all I saw while in the East, to fully accept at the time. It required years of meditation to bring me the realization of the deep spiritual meaning of these people's lives. Their work is accomplished without ostentation and in perfect childlike simplicity. They know the power of love to protect them, and they cultivate it until all nature is in love with them and befriends them. Thousands of the common people are killed annually by serpents and wild animals, yet these masters have so brought forth the power of love in themselves that serpents and wild animals do not injure them. They live at times in the wildest jungles and are sometimes lay their bodies down before a village to protect it from the ravages of wild animals, and no harm befalls the village or themselves. When occasion requires, they walk on water, go through fire, travel in the invisible, or do many other things that we have been accustomed to look upon as miracles, performed only by one supposed in some way to possess supernatural powers. And here is his final understanding. He tried to pass on why this works. This is not the mortal self, the self you see, that is able to do these things. It is a truer, deeper self. It is what you know as God, God within me, God the omnipotent, one working through me that does these things. Of myself, the mortal self, I can do nothing. It is only when I get rid of the outer entirely and let the I am Speak and work and let the great love of God come forth, that I can do these things that you have seen. When you let the love of God pour through you to all things, nothing fears you, and no harm can befall you. Thank you.